So in AngularJS, when we use a watch statement, it allows us to observe changes of values within the scope and then respond to those changes. And most of the time we just watch simple string values, which contain references to the scope. But you can also watch functions in AngularJS, and this has some interesting properties and has some interesting payoffs in terms of the flexibility now in the way that we can observe changes. So I set up a little demo here to look at the way that functions interact. So we have a best friend. You can see that as I change the best friend selection, we're getting a whole bunch of output down here in the log of things that are being watched in various ways as the status of the best friend changes within the demo. And most of these are being done within a function that we are watching. And so let's take a look at the code just to see what's going on there. So the demo itself is pretty simple. I just have two friends, and then I have a set best friend, and that takes the particular friend and that changes the best friend status. And you can see, I'll jump down here, that as I set the friend, this best friend is being updated, and various flags here for the CSS are being changed. But that's inconsequential. That's basically just so that we can set up the watch statements and actually see something change. The first one I want to look at is a watch function here that takes this function expression. And when you use a function expression, there's two things to understand, or three things to understand. One, this function is going to get called multiple times per digest. And you can see here I have this function watch being logged. And when I jump back here, you can see here's function watch and function watch. It's being called twice. And when I change, you can see it gets called twice again. So it's getting called multiple times per digest. The other thing to realize is that if I return a value from this function that I'm watching, that this return value becomes the value that AngularJS watches when it determines whether or not to invoke your watch callback. So you can see function best friend is, and if I jump back here, let me clear this, and I go here, you can see function best friend is Trisha. Now notice that my watch function got called twice, but my watch callback was only called once, and that's because between these two changes the value didn't actually change more than once, so the callback only had to be called once. So that's the difference a little bit between the number of times this is invoked versus the number of times this is invoked. Now the third important thing to understand about these watch functions is that scope is being passed in as the first argument. So not only does this make it easier perhaps to reference scope within the body of this function, but it opens us up to being able to pass in any function that expects scope as the first value and returns a value that can be watched, essentially. And that opens us up to some interesting opportunities like the interpolate service. Interpolate takes a string that requires interpolation. You can see that I'm doing the double braces here to interpolate the best friend within a particular scope. Now at this point we don't know what this scope is because it's just a string value. But when you call the interpolate service, what it does is it returns a function, and that function, when executed, expects a scope value, expects a scope reference, and returns the result of the interpolation in the context of said scope reference. So essentially, the interpolate function is returning this function where it takes the scope and returns the value of the interpolation. And then we can watch that resultant value of the interpolation. So here you can see interpolate : best friend is. And if I jump back here and I clear again, and I switch, you can see here we get interpolate best friend is Joanna. If I switch again, we get interpolate best friend is Trisha. Now again, you'll notice that even though that original watch function is being called multiple times, the interpolate callback is only being called once per change in the value. So even though probably the interpolate function itself, which we don't see, is being invoked multiple times per digest, our callback is only getting called that one time. So I don't know, I mean that's kind of cool. Most of the time, like I said, we'll just watch simple string values. But the fact that we can watch the function, that the function takes particular inputs and expects particular outputs, and that lines up nicely with interpolate, I mean that's kind of cool. And then just as a control for this experiment, you can see that I'm here passing in a string value which represents an expression of string concatenation that does kind of the same thing that the interpolate is doing-ish, right? Because this probably gets parsed into a function expression internally with Angular, and then Angular will execute that multiple times per digest, return a value, and then this gets called based on whether or not the value changes. So I don't know, maybe a pretty minor demo here, but certainly I think the flexibility here in AngularJS is pretty cool. And the way that these things line up very nicely probably makes certain things easier to do. So keep that in mind.